next concept that we want to familiarize ourselves with is basically trigger control. Now, most people think that squeezing a trigger is pretty fundamentally easy. You just push the trigger back. That's not necessarily true. Beginner shooters don't put enough effort into maximizing the efficiency of their trigger control, and therefore they miss a lot of shots because of that. We're going to go over the right way in the 4 parts, and then we're going to go over some common mistakes. Okay, so first off, the 4 fundamentals or the 4 steps to trigger control are: 1, the take-up. And keep in mind, if you're shooting a highly customized, high-end 1911, a Les Bear, or a Nighthawk, or some of the higher-end, even Wilsons, and some of the other ones that have done a lot of work to them, a lot of these parts are going to be just incredibly minimal. This is a factory trigger in a Glock 19, so the different fundamentals of this are going to be very factory, very much more oriented to the type of shooter that is probably watching this video. So the first one is the take-up. Otherwise, I'm taking out the slack. Okay, I'm getting from the initial point of where I start to move the trigger to the break point. Okay, that's taking the slack out of the trigger. Now the second part of that is the actual break point. Once I've reached that wall and then I squeeze anything past that, as I press that trigger past that break point, it's going to then break the shot. Okay, so that's part 2. So the take up, the break, and then following the break is the follow through. Now on a lot of more modern firearms, the follow through is very minimal. For instance, on a Glock, it's not very tactile. You can't feel it real well. But the follow through also is just following through on all your forms to where that front sight just settles back on the target. Okay, so your grip, your recoil control, some of the things we've covered in other topics, you want to make sure that as that comes down, you're just settling right back on target because of good follow through. Now, at that point, your gun is going to cycle. Boom. All right. Now the shot has broke. You've gone through your follow through. I'm still holding the trigger down. At this point, I will release the trigger, but not all the way back out. I release it only until what's called the reset. That's the last part. Reset. The reset just takes it back to that break point, allowing me to break the shot again. The important distinction there is, if you think about it, watch the distance of the trigger pull here. I've got all that slack, all that take up, boom. Okay, versus barely letting the trigger back out to the break point. So therefore, your first shot is going to be a longer trigger press because you're going to be prepping that trigger. You'll hear that as far as like taking out the slack. You'll also hear people saying prep the trigger. I'm prepping the trigger. Now I break the shot. Now the gun recoils after the follow through. It's recoiling. I follow through. My sights settle back on target. I reset and break another shot. From there, again, the gun recoils. Good follow through. Reset. Break another shot. The 4 steps to a good fundamental trigger press. Prepping the trigger, taking the slack out. Break. It recoils, we're following through. Reset, break again. Now let's take a look at what some people do incorrectly. One of the first things that I see that people do incorrectly is either having too much or too little trigger finger onto the trigger. Most people, especially beginners, think that you should have that joint, that last joint before your fingerprint, that pad of your finger, they have that joint on the middle part of the trigger. That's not what we want. People that do that often have the tendency to pull the trigger. In fact, you in any of our classes, or any of the things that we say, you won't hear us say pull the trigger, because people have the tendency to do exactly that, pull it. And they'll pull it. Normally a right-handed shooter will miss to the right because they have too much trigger finger and they're pulling it to the right. Okay. Conversely, if you have too little trigger, you will normally push the firearm. So you'll be pushing it this way as opposed to pressing it straight back toward the rear. I don't like the term trigger pull. Pull the trigger. I don't like that. I like press the trigger to the rear. So when you're here and you go to press that trigger, now you want to make sure that you're just going straight backward. In fact, it would be ideal, when we talk about our grip, we talk about if we could get directly behind the bore and hold the gun like this, that would be maximum efficiency because we're in line with the bore axis. Obviously we can't do that, but that would be where the ideal point would be. The same is true for the trigger. If we could have one metal bar that came through and just pushed straight back to the rear, that would be ideal because you're getting completely equal pressure throughout the entire trigger press. We can't do that, obviously. So the closest that we can get is the middle part of that pad where your fingerprint is. Just the most middle point of that will go straight onto the center of the trigger. On a Glock, there's the what they call the safety. It's the middle part of the trigger. That's where I like to index my finger to. On a 1911 or whatever, I mean, you shoot a gun enough, you'll figure out where it should be in your hand. But that's where I like to be. Okay, so the middle of that trigger, or the middle of the pad should be on the middle of the trigger. So again, prep, break, follow through, reset, break. Okay, you got 4 parts to trigger control. The next problem that I see a lot of people have is in the reset. Even people that have been shooting a long time. A lot of times people think that you pull the trigger, the gun cycles, you pull the trigger, the gun cycles, you pull the trigger. Incorrect. You want to make sure that after your first shot, when you're here, you keep your finger pressed all the way down. The trigger is completely pressed. So the gun has cycled. Now as the gun settles back into battery, now I will reset. And I will go to pressing the trigger again. So it cycles the firearm, reset. And you can hear it, especially on a Glock. You can really hear that. That's the point. And I don't want to let it all the way back out. You'll hear people do what's called slapping the trigger. When they let the gun all the way back out and they're just slapping back on the trigger. You don't want that. That right there is going to be shots all over the place. You don't want, I mean, there's very little control right there. You want to make sure that as the gun cycles and you're holding a good follow through, as the gun comes back, or your front sight comes back on the target, you just reset. It's a very, very minimal amount that you have to let the trigger back out before you can cycle the firearm again. That break point. Again, some highly customized firearms for competition, whatever your high-end 1911s especially, that reset is just, I mean, virtually nothing. You can just barely move your finger and you're getting shots downrange. Factory triggers, especially your double action or your safe action firearms like Glocks, they do have a little bit more of a reset, and it's I like the feeling of it because it's a good, powerful click. You can hear it, you can feel it. It lets you know when the gun is ready to cycle again.